We shall move immediately to our next speaker, Eirik Eiglad, who will speak on shame, guilt, and the politics of memory. Okay.
Thank you. On May 1st, 2015, Samuel Steinmann died. He was the Norwegian Jew and a survivor of Auschwitz, and with him, we lost the last living victim of the Holocaust in Norway. It's a general problem in Europe, in the United States, and in Israel. How do we preserve this memory when all the witnesses are gone? Yoav Shamir, in his 2009 documentary, Disfamation, ponders why it had become increasingly important to bring young Israelis to visit death camps in Europe, something that was not considered necessary when he was young. I thought the question slightly obscene, but I had to relate to it because I was invited to talk on a panel, and that was the subject of the discussion. I found out just before. But I found the answer obvious. When witnesses and survivors die out, we need to find ways of transmitting our knowledge and help new generations understand the past. Much has been written about the Holocaust and the problems it poses for our collective memory. Today, some 75 years after the Second World War, not only are the victims of the Shoah the last survivors dying out, but so too are the perpetrators, so too are the collaborators and the bystanders. This, in many respects, changes the very premises of the debate regarding the historical questions of shame and guilt. To what extent do generations born after the war carry a responsibility for what happened during the war and the Shoah? In Norway, respected intellectuals have recently asked, how long are we going to have to feel ashamed of what happened during the war? And brazenly declared that we are not Quisling's children. These comments came in response to a Facebook post March 31st last year by Raphael Schutz, the Israeli ambassador to Norway at the time. Schutz caused a great commotion when he claimed in a social media debate that, I quote, an industry of lies and pure anti-Semitism was only what could be expected from a descendant of Quisling. The reactions came immediately. Rødt, a leftist party, demanded the immediate expulsion of the ambassador. Others on the political left argued that it was an attempt to stifle legitimate criticisms of Israel. Representatives of the Conservative Party was also indignant because, as they pointed out, Quisling's ideas and its followers had been a political fringe group before, during, and after the war. Others pointed out that we were not responsible for Nazi anti-Semitism. Many Norwegians had even helped Jews escape at great personal risk. The ambassador claimed to be misquoted. In the first media report, he had allegedly had stated that all Norwegians are descendants of Quisling. He was responding to a particular Facebook debate and a set of comments by Ole Ingvald Hansen, who is a Labour Party representative in the Hammerfest City Council and an outspoken anti-Zionist. Quisling would be proud of you, Schutz had written. Now, we can all argue how smart the comments were, or whether such use of social media is at all appropriate for an Israeli representative. The ambassador faced harsh criticisms from across the political spectrum. Few things disturb us more than to be reminded of our anti-Semitic past, particularly when it comes to association to Quisling, who, after all, is introduced as a general term in the English language meaning traitor to one's country. Just to calm things down, I wrote an opinion piece where I stated, but we are Quisling's children. Rubbish, said Arnfinn Moland, a historian of the Norwegian resistance movement. Should all Norwegians feel ashamed for what happened to Jews during the war? In recent years, Moland claims, the distribution of guilt between the occupation government and Norwegians as such is totally out of proportions. And make no mistake, Moland is not at all an anti-Semite, he's not a defender of Nazism, but he argues that my stance and that of others in Norway contributes to cleanse Nazism of guilt. Our stance, he claims, normalizes the criminal anti-Semitic worldview by smearing it thinly over a people that he claims that, with the exception of 2 or 3%, totally rejected Nazism. These objections are worth considering, and I will respond to them in turn. Indeed, in this talk, I will try to address some of the deeper questions that relates to this public debate. Try to bring up some of the more conceptual and or theoretical questions, but I will draw on the Norwegian experience and recent debates. This recent debate precisely because I think they're instructive for understanding in a more general sense how we're dealing with our past. And I hope that by the time I reach the end of this talk, I hope it will be clear why I think, in what sense I think that I and others are indeed descendants of Quisling, and why I think that that is totally unproblematical. I will pause to summarize the main reasons why Molen and others think it's time to end our national self-flagellation. That's the English term, I guess.
Flagellation, yeah.
Flagellation, yeah. Direct quote. I've made up some terms in order to classify their arguments. First, there is the temporal argument. Nobody alive in Norway today participated in the Holocaust. Then there's what I would call a more legal argument. We have paid our debt, first by acknowledging the historical crimes, the facts of the Shoah, as well as by the compensation and restitution processes. There is also the numerical argument. Very few of the total Norwegian population were ideological Nazis and actively supported its anti-Jewish policies. Connected to this, there are also some external arguments that Nazism was a foreign power, a foreign ideology forced upon us, and an agency argument that life under occupation made it impossible to choose and act freely, that there was simply no room to maneuver ethically. Connected to this is the universal victim argument, and I was that we were all victims of the Nazis. Jews were particularly unfortunate, but we all suffered under Nazi occupation. Most of these arguments can be considered legitimate, particularly if we operate within the parameters of guilt and shame. But I will argue this is not what is at stake here. I've skipped the discussion here of the more psychological dimensions of guilt and shame and cultural repercussions. I will only note that they bar our understanding of responsibility, and also I will acknowledge that these questions of historical guilt do create peculiar sets of problems in countries like Norway or Poland, who were countries occupied by Nazi Germany, and importantly, where many actively fought the Nazi occupation. Yet, it is also true that recent debates occur in a new historical context with new political and cultural challenges in a political climate that is dramatically changing, particularly in its conception of Israel and the Holocaust. Understanding how new generations and their teachers interpret the politics of memory is crucial to confront and challenge contemporary forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli prejudice. Some of the recent discussions in Norway point to some of the challenges we face, at least in Western Europe. How can we claim responsibility without having to accept guilt or blame or the feeling of shame for what we did or did not do during the war? This question becomes urgent as the most virulent critics of the Jewish state come from the political left, from traditions that helped defeat the Nazis historically. Today, they are instrumental in Holocaust minimization, trivialization, relativization, and inversion, and they often launch criticisms of Israel that places the responsibility of the Nazi genocide on the Jews themselves. In my original paper, I hope to go more into these historical and political and ethical paradoxes, and I've cut a long session about how we're dealing actually with memory. How have we come to reach our understanding of the Holocaust? It took more than 50 years before the restitution process was put in motion, and there are interesting Holocaust scholarships that is important, and some recent debates that are very interesting regarding collaboration, the resistance movements, and I would also like to discuss more about government responses, particularly in their plans of actions against anti-Semitism, and also popular responses and how it's treated in schools and in curriculums. But I will skip that to kind of focus a little more on that polemic, because since I've thrown it out, I wanted to go a bit more in detail about that polemic, my reasoning, because Nazi accusation or Quisling's, it's not something I take lightly. And I do not mean to imply that all Norwegians are Nazis, of course, or neither are we directly related to Quisling himself. Nobody in today's Norway are guilty of the persecution of Jews or the Holocaust, but we do belong to the culture that made possible the destruction of the European Jews. And in my view, this is not really controversial. It's part of our history. As I mentioned, the Israeli ambassador claimed to be misquoted. And he was referring to, in that Facebook debate, specific statements that equals Israeli policies to Nazi Germany, that claims that a thirst for blood is what drives Israelis to kill Palestinians, and that claims that Israel claims that Israel is not a legitimate state. Schutz meant, and he was spot on, that these were particularly distasteful comments uttered by people who should know better. For Schutz, it was the content of these statements that proved the link to Quisling. In contrast to Schutz, as I said, I do think that we're all Quisling's children, and I don't find it problematical. And I don't see this as an act of self-hatred or self-flagellation at all. On the contrary, as long as we're conscious of this anti-Semitic legacy, it can only strengthen our cultural self-knowledge and self-perception and help us avoid the mistakes that former generations did, mistakes they made both out of cruelty and out of foolishness. Neither is it a question of hereditary sin or collective guilt. We're not to be blamed for Quisling's regime, but we do have a special responsibility, as it happened here amongst us, and that this is something that concerns us all. Since anti-Semitism shaped crucial parts of our history, this recognition should shape our future. But, of course, it can be argued that the question of Quisling's legacy is not only a historical or cultural question, it's also an ideological one. This ideological connection is what makes the statement insulting. By saying that we're Quisling's children, am I not implying that simply by being Norwegian we harbor Quisling's ideas and in that sense are responsible for his action? No, it's not that. None of us get the chance to choose where we're born. We do not choose what culture we're born into. We do not get to choose our parents. I'm not guilty of what past generations have done or failed to do, but we have to make sense of their actions and attitudes. Unless one believes in some permanent national character, that there are some essential biological or biocultural qualities that is linked to one's nationality and culture, this argument doesn't hold. I don't believe that there is an essential quality to being Norwegian, or that the mere question of historical context or cultural ancestry transmits culpability through the generations. By the same token, by being raised in a Protestant culture, we are in important respects also children of Martin Luther. Even I, an atheist, have to relate to Luther's deeds and his teachings, including his anti-Jewish legacy. That is not to say that they are our only ancestors. And this is an important point. We are also children of those who fought Nazism, who welcomed Jews to Norway, who expanded the notion of what it means to be Norwegian or European, of all those who advocate advanced democracy, socialism, feminism, secularism, tolerance, and human rights. And what makes our discussion on the legacy of Quisling is so problematical, it's of course that the fact that anti-Jewish attitudes is not simply a question of the past. In today's Europe, anti-Semitic attitudes are still powerful political cultural and political undercurrents, and more and more these attitudes are justified as criticisms of Israel or anti-Zionism. This principle of responsibility does not only apply to Norwegian, but to other religious, ethnic, or ideological groups. When church leaders deny Israel's right to exist, they prove that they have not confronted Christianity's legacy of anti-Judaism. Poles who deny any responsibility for the country's death camps have not confronted Polish anti-Semitism. Communists who call for the destruction of Israel have not confronted Stalin's anti-Zionism. We're children of traditions and children of ideologies. But claims that the Jewish occupation started in 1948, that it's an apartheid state, or that Israeli policies are comparable to Nazi Germany are not only misguided and distasteful, I believe they're extremely dangerous and attitudes that must be confronted. And here, I do think that a special responsibility rests on the shoulders of Norwegians and other Europeans. There were many more engaged in that debate regarding the ambassador's comment, and many of them were proud anti-Zionists. I'm not so concerned here with the extreme anti-Zionist or anti-Israeli attitudes. Many of them are explicitly seeking to erase Israel from the map and not ashamed of being anti-Zionist. I'm troubled because the moral bulwarks that once stemmed anti-Jewish attitudes after the Second World War now seems to disappear, and it's anti-Zionism that makes them crumble. Anti-Zionism has spread far into the labor movement and its trade unions, far into Christian churches and Christian youth organizations, and it's widespread among immigrants of both Catholic and Muslim origin. Anti-Zionist ideas have even moved into the center of politics. In the 1970s, anti-Israeli activists had a strategy to win over, and I quote, to win over parties and organizations for Palestine. And today, in many respects, they have succeeded, even in a country like Norway. So, what's the take-home lesson here? It's certainly not that we should be able to distinguish Nazi anti-Semitism and condemn the Holocaust simply as the culmination of an extreme form of racism. This is important, to be sure, but not the most important lesson. It's just, that would be just a point of reference, that where our criticism should start. To illustrate this, I would like us to consider what we would have wished to see by, say, a Catholic priest in Vienna or a Lutheran pastor in a German village at the turn of the last century. We would have hoped that he would recognize the suffering caused by the church during the Crusades or the Reconquista, that he should be able to detect the aggressively anti-Jewish sentiments of both Martin Luther and the Catholic Church, and how these ideas fed into medieval pogroms and anti-Judaic policies. That would be a decent start. But it's only a start. It wouldn't have been able to stem the tide of the new racial anti-Semitism or the rising fascist movement. One would rather hope, I expect, that priests and pastors and teachers of the time would be able to distinguish how new forms of anti-Jewish sentiments were brewing within their culture, and that they felt a specific responsibility to confront these ideas and this new terminology, particularly because of their own Christian legacy of anti-Judaic prejudice and persecution. Similarly, when I claim that we are Quisling's children, I do by no means imply that we should be content on remaining fixated on the Nazi legacy of anti-Semitism. On the contrary, we should rather acknowledge our specific responsibility in deciphering the new languages, the new sentiments, the new policies that anti-Jewish attitudes take. Today, these take the form of anti-Zionism. I've argued here before, and I'm very grateful for being able to come back and to learn from you all. So thank you for that, Alvin and the others. But I've argued that I think anti-Zionism is by far the most dangerous form of anti-Semitism we face today. I believe that anti-Zionism today is what anti-Semitism was at the turn of the last century. Here, as everyone noticed, I'm using anti-Semitism both in its broad sense and its precise sense. Either the term encompasses all varieties of anti-Jewish experience, at least 2,000 years old, or it's a narrower expression of racial anti-Semitism that was developed by Wilhelm Marr and his followers in the 1870s and culminated in the death camps in Western Europe and the massacres on the Eastern Front. Before I continue, I must just remark that I'm aware of these difficulties in the definition here. But for the most part, I use the term now in its last sense as racial anti-Semitism. I said, yeah, it's the most dangerous form of anti-Semitism we face today, and anti-Zionism is today what anti-Semitism was at the turn of the last century. I can't go deeper into this, and I think that my time is running out, but
You have still 2-3 minutes.
okay. But I just want to make the point that when anti-Semitism was developed at the turn of the last century, it was perceived as a fresh idea. It was scientific. It was based on racial categories in sharp contrast to the earlier traditional and theological prejudice. Anti-Semitism got it as a racial doctrine, got much of its vitality precisely from showing how much it distinguished itself from old, backward-looking anti-Judaic prejudices of the church, while at the same time, as we know, was still feeding on the same age-old imageries and simmering anti-Jewish prejudice. This happens today too, as anti-Zionism conquers the imagination of new generations, mobilizing activists that often would vehemently oppose anti-Semitism if and when they recognize it. And I realize that there may be different experiences in Central or Eastern Europe or in the Middle East. But regarding Norway and Western Europe, and I would assume countries like USA and Canada too, anti-Semitism in its open form is illegitimate and publicly condemned. But when we are confronted by anti-Zionism, we fail to notice the same patterns of prejudice. Why is it the most dangerous form of anti-Semitism? Isn't it just a code word for anti-Semitism? Or, on the other hand, is it not just a legitimate political idea that sometimes crosses over into anti-Semitism? And am I not diminishing anti-Zionism by saying that it's not just a disguised form of anti-Semitism, but something entirely new? I will explain briefly why. First, I think anti-Zionism today is breeding a culture of indifference. Jeffrey Herf pointed out how Nazi policies depended not only on the active perpetrators, but on how centuries of anti-Jewish propaganda and new racist theories made large sectors of the population indifferent to the faith of the Jews. I believe that today, anti-Zionism is breeding a culture of indifference to the faith of Jews and of Israel. At least in Norway, the anti-Semitism in its classical form does not breed such culture of indifference. I believe that goes for the Western Europe and the USA too. Second, anti-Zionism is breeding a culture of suspicion. Today's massive social propaganda against Israel on Israeli apartheid, of accusations of willful massacres and genocide, is eroding our ability, and I speak here of the general public, our ability to speak up against anti-Israeli or anti-Jewish attitudes. The totally disproportionate attention given to Israeli war crimes, indeed to all Israeli military activity, are often linked with traditional images of Jewish power. And this is maybe the category where anti-Zionist prejudice and classic anti-Semitic imagery work closest in tandem. But here, I think that the classical anti-Semitic imagery, when exposed, is unacceptable for ordinary Norwegians. But it's a strong undercurrent that should not be overlooked. Not in social media, nor in regular media, or darker side of the web. I believe that even if the lie is repeated 1,000 times, we may still not believe it, but we would probably be quite suspicious of anyone who would challenge that lie. And third, is it finished? Totally?
You have to finish.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, I have just a few paragraphs left. Third, anti-Zionism is breeding a culture of initiative. This takes on seemingly innocuous forms, such as the frantic campaigns to win over trade unions, sport clubs, municipal councils, campuses, youth associations, student organizations, and political parties. Resistance to Israel, its war and its politics, is countered by a culture of initiative. Everyone can do his or her part to stop Zionism. Often this is claimed as a peaceful resistance, but there is also a strong justification of anti-Israeli terror and anti-Jewish attacks, claiming that these are the results of sheer desperation as the only way to fight against or act against the Zionist behemoth. Anti-Semitism in its classical forms, either based on racist or religious justifications, may fuel the most vicious attacks, but I believe that it's anti-Zionism that is breeding this culture of initiative today, And it is anti-Zionism that had created a broad platform for anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish activism in ways that anti-Semitism in its classical forms are not able to do. Lastly, we should not forget that anti-Zionism itself is nurturing a culture of hatred. Attacks or murders on Jews are often directly or indirectly justified as legitimate responses to Zionist aggression. We should not be duped into believing that anti-Zionism simply is an innocent voice for peace that sometimes, and only sometimes, spills over into lethal anti-Semitism. Calls to kill the Zionists, to end Zionism, to destroy the Zionist entity is not simply the aberrant statements that made by individuals that fail to understand its genuine message. It's integral to anti-Zionism. I believe that anti-Zionism is going to define anti-Jewish thought for this century. In its wake follows all the classical forms of anti-Semitism. But I do believe that anti-Zionism is a driving force of anti-Jewish sentiment and the only variation that has mass appeal. And this is what makes it particularly dangerous. So, to return to my topic and conclude, I would say that the authorities in Norway, the whole section that I didn't really deal with, they are doing important work on anti-Semitism today. Wheels are in motion, but it's not enough. And in some sense, I feel that our leaders are fighting the battles of the last war. I'm afraid that the overly backward-looking focus on the Holocaust, on the Norwegian war experience, on classical expressions of anti-Semitism as racism, and on individual hate crimes or even schoolyard bullying, which are all necessary and essential, I feel that they fail to understand and stem the most pernicious form of anti-Semitism today, anti-Zionism.
Thank you.